So we have now 3 lectures starting today, and we have completed at least a few major types of systems that work in energy conversion. Right? We had studied refrigeration systems first, then we studied internal combustion engines, then about fuels combustion, then we studied about turbo machinery, right? Nozzles and turbo machinery. Now this is actually a reverse order to study various things, but because our focus was on the thermodynamics of the whole process, we started like that, because the thermodynamic understanding of each of these things was independent of each other. So we were able to study refrigeration systems separately, we were able to study IC engines separately, we were able to study turbines separately, nozzles separately, and so on. But in a real world, all of these systems actually work as part of a much larger system. Right? Most of you visited a power plant, and we were this time fortunate enough to see 2 completely different kinds of power plants. Right? One is a coal-fired steam power plant, the other is a natural gas-fired combined cycle power plant. If you look at the overall construction and working of such power plants, the basic thermodynamic cycle of that we had studied in the earlier thermodynamics course. Okay, we just looked at the major parts, each of it drawn in the form of a rectangle or a trapezium, right, without saying what's inside that. Some of what we studied in this course actually opened up those boxes to you and said, okay, what is inside this box and what is inside that box. We understood something about the various components. So what I plan to do in the lectures today, Monday and part of Thursday, is to put all of these things together in the form of an entire cycle, working cycle of a larger context, typically in power generation. So what we will look at will be steam based power plants to start with, then gas turbine based power plants, aircraft gas turbine engines, and combined cycle power plants. These are 4 larger systems which use many of these components that we had studied so far. In fact, those of you who went on the trip to the power plant would understand that describing a power plant in terms of these components alone would also be like the 5 blind men describing an elephant, right? Whichever part that you could perceive at that point of time, you thought that was the elephant, right? So even a description of this nature that I would do today would be a very simplistic description, because a real working power plant actually has grown up as complex as an organism. Right. So I cannot describe each of you individuals by your biometrics or by your iris scan, although that's a signature of yours, right? But each individual is made up of a lot more complexities. You are not an assembly of components, and that's not quite exactly, but to a great extent similar to the description of large systems like power plants also, because these days the experience of mankind with these systems has increased or has gone such a long way that these systems have grown up much more than assembly of components, right? Because otherwise, just give you a set of components and all of you can assemble a power plant. It's not enough, right, to actually be able to assemble a power plant and operate it. It's a lot more organic than just an assembly of components. That's basically what I wanted to tell you. So the effort that I will make in today's class and the next couple of classes will be to synthesize the information that we gathered all over this course plus the previous thermodynamics courses into the working of a few of these large scale power generation systems. In fact, when we started the course, in the first couple of lectures or first lecture probably, we took the broad perspective starting from what is energy and what is the need for its conversion perspective. So we found that energy conversion as such should also encompass the various sources of energy, the ways of harnessing them, the ways of utilizing them, and the way of taking care of the environment in the process, which therefore is a much more integrated science, not just mechanical engineering, but a lot more than just mechanical engineering also, right. So, and when you go to a power plant, you find that mechanical and electrical engineering are completely inseparable, and on top of that controls actually is a science which is taught in a little bit of conception in various different branches of engineering. Mechanical engineers learn control theory in a certain way, and electrical engineers learn control theory in a certain way. Computer scientists look at control theory in a certain way. Mathematicians look at control theory in a different way. The science of control engineering actually interleaves with all of these engineering concepts to a great extent, because ultimately when you have a power plant of that magnitude, you cannot have individuals monitoring each one of the components or their synergy 24 hours. So you need to have all of those parameters gathered in one place and monitored by sophisticated software taking care of the control strategies. When something fails, then what should be the mechanism, what is the dynamics of the system when something fails, and how long can you delay the restoration mechanism without major problems to the system, is another analysis that one needs to do about the control. So basically a real engineering system is, number one, the basic concepts of thermodynamics, fluid mechanics and heat transfer of individual components from the mechanical engineering side, and perhaps the basic electrical engineering concepts on the electrical engineering side for the machines like motors, generators and stuff like that. But an integrated power plant is actually a little bit of mechanical engineering, a little bit of electrical engineering and a little bit of other kinds of engineering perhaps, but a lot more civil engineering, the construction of the whole thing, but a lot more of engineering experience. Okay, so that's something which you cannot classify into one class of engineering or the other. Engineering experience is engineering experience, and that's something which comes on top of all of that and connects all of them together into a logical organic unit. And that's why the human being that operates the power plant, who sits in that control room looking at all those complex screens that you perhaps saw in the power plant, a human being who's operating that needs to have the experience and exposure of what are the right steps and what are the wrong steps in operating a power plant, because a certain kind of control strategy would lead to a certain amount of losses in terms of financial terms to the company that is running the power plant, and certain other control strategy would mean certain other kind of losses, and the person in charge who is sitting there in a fraction of a second would need to make his judgment on which would be less of a damage to the company, because quite frequently the damage control measures are what are there in the hands of an operator there. So long as the power plant is operating at steady state without any events, the job is fine, but the moment the system starts going into crisis, the individual who is sitting there alone may not be able to handle it. He would immediately call up people that are more experienced, people that are more senior in position, who can take decisions on his behalf, and some decisions the individual who is sitting there has to take at the spur of the moment, because it cannot wait for all these phone calls. So a whole system therefore is much more than the components or the engineering that go into the components, but it's a lot more human experience in the whole process. So this is the basic premise from which we should start. So at least we don't pretend that we are studying power plants as a whole, but we are actually looking at those power plants in the context of whatever we know, right. So that's the effort that we will be doing now. Before I go into that, in fact, centrifugal pumps is something that we talked about in the last lecture. I would like to give a couple of videos which completely summarize the topics that one needs to understand about centrifugal pumps. There's one topic that is missing in these two videos. I'll show you two videos and I'll talk about the concept that is missing which you need to understand, because centrifugal pumps are something which are used everywhere. And if I send out an energy conversion class without understanding centrifugal pumps even to that extent, I would be committing a crime. So I would like to show those videos first and then we'll talk about power plants. Okay, so first a couple of videos on centrifugal pumps.
Centrifugal pumps are the most preferred pumping devices in the hydraulic world. In this video, we will have a conceptual overview of working of centrifugal pumps. At the heart of the system lies the impeller. It has got a series of curved vanes fitted inside shroud plates. The impeller is always immersed in water. When the impeller is made to rotate, it makes the fluid surrounding it also rotate. This imparts centrifugal force to water particles, and the water moves radially out. Since rotational mechanical energy is transferred to the fluid, at discharge sides of impeller, both pressure and kinetic energy of water will rise. At suction side, water is getting displaced, so a negative pressure will be induced at I. Such low pressure helps in sucking fresh water stream into the system again, and this process continues. This is the reason why priming is important for centrifugal pumps. If no water is present initially, the negative pressure developed by rotating air at I of impeller will be negligibly small to suck fresh stream of water. Impeller is fitted inside a casing, so the water moving out will be collected inside it and will move in the same direction of rotation of impeller to the discharge nozzle. Here you can note one specialty of casing. It has got increasing area along the flow direction. Such increasing area will help in accommodating newly added water stream and will also help in reducing exit flow velocity. Reduction in flow velocity will result in increase in static pressure, which is required to overcome resistance of pumping system. Here you can see more details of vanes inside impeller. They are backward curved vanes with state-of-the-art I configuration. This vane is extracted from a Kirloskar pump model. If pressure at suction side of impeller goes below vapor pressure of water, a dangerous phenomenon could happen. Water will start to boil, forming vapor bubbles and spoil impeller materials over time. This phenomenon is known as cavitation. More the suction head, lesser should be the pressure at suction side to lift water. This fact puts a limit to maximum suction head a pump can have. Careful pump selection is required to avoid problem of cavitation. Current impeller type is enclosed. Semi-open and open impellers are also in use depending upon application. If the working fluid is cloggy in nature, it is preferred to use open kind of impeller, but they are slightly less efficient. Mechanical design of centrifugal pump is always challenging. A shaft is used to connect between the impeller and motor. Since water pressure inside casing is huge, a proper sealing arrangement is imperative in arresting water leakage through shaft casing clearance. Mechanical seal or stuffing box based mechanism is used for this purpose. Impeller is mounted on bearings, but at suction side of impeller it is not advisable to fit a bearing since it will block the flow. So bearings have to be fitted at the other end. This means impeller is mounted like a cantilever. For high flow rate pumps, a bearing housing with cooling oil is necessary for improving life of bearings. We thank Kirloskar Brothers for their technical support and creation of this video.
Centrifugal pumps are most commonly used turbo machinery devices, which are used to raise pressure, or induce flow in a control volume. They are radial flow devices. Various kinds of centrifugal pumps are available in market, with different construction details, but working principle behind all of them remains same. In this video we will analyze working principle of a centrifugal pump with single suction, semi-open impeller. One of such pump is shown in figure, with one part of its casing removed for ease of understanding. Working of centrifugal pump is simple. As the impeller rotates, it sucks fluid from outside through eye of impeller. The fluid is pushed radially along the impeller to the casing. Casing collects the fluid, and it is pumped out through discharge nozzle. We will go through main components of a centrifugal pump in a detailed way. First, impeller. Impeller is the device which rotates and transfer energy to fluid. It has got collection of vanes fitted to a hub plate. Next component is casing, which collects fluid from impeller in an efficient way. The casing has got a special shape, with area of cross-section increases from inlet to outlet. As the impeller ejects fluid throughout casing, a long length of casing mass flow rate increases. But, increasing area of casing helps in maintaining almost same velocity. Thus volute-shaped casing helps in converting dynamic part of fluid energy to static part. It will be interesting to know about construction details of volute casing. Casing is made on two volute curves, which are at offset. A three-dimensional volute is made from this curves. A portion is removed from volute shape, in order to accommodate the impeller in it. A discharge nozzle is fit at exit portion of the casing. Most of the time discharge nozzle is diverging in shape. For centrifugal pumps of small capacity, as we discussed, impeller and casing are its main components. But, for larger centrifugal pumps, there will be additional diffuser blades also present, in order to reduce velocity further. Or, they aid in dynamic to static energy conversion. Now, we will see how to predict pressure rise. Blade velocities, at inlet and outlet are shown here. Fluid velocities at inlet and outlet are also marked. Here you can see, fluid velocity increases from inlet to outlet, due to energy addition to fluid. The work required for changing inlet velocity condition to outlet, is given by this equation. We will go through such turbo machinery analysis in a separate video. Here Q is the flow rate, and V theta represents tangential velocity component of flow. For a centrifugal pump, inlet velocity will be parallel to radius, so tangential component at inlet is 0. From here we can find what's the head rise in meters of fluid. Outlet blade angle beta can be derived in terms of velocities. Also flow rate through impeller is given as flow area times radial velocity. So head rise in a centrifugal pump can be derived in terms of flow rate. Using this we can predict what's the head rise, as we change the flow rate, for a particular pump geometry, and a particular impeller angular velocity. Most important parameter in this equation is blade outlet angle, beta. There can be three different pump characteristics depending upon value of this angle. First case, if beta is less than 90 degree. Since this term is positive in this case, pressure head decreases, with increase in flow. These kinds of impellers are called backward curved. If beta is 90 degree, with flow rate, there is no change in pressure rise. Because this term is 0 here. They are called radial type. If beta is more than 90 degree, pressure increases with increase in flow rate. Such blades are called forward curve blades. The big question, out of these which one is the most suited for industrial use? To get answer for this question, let's see how power consumption varies with discharge for each of these cases. For backward curved blades, as pressure head decreases with discharge, power consumption stabilizes with flow. In radial blades, since pressure does not have any connection with flow rate, power consumption increases linearly. In forward curved blades, since pressure head increases with flow, power consumption increases exponentially, making the operation unstable. This will lead to burnout of motor. So backward curved blades, which has got self-stabilizing characteristics, in power consumption is the most preferred one in industry. To know more practical aspects of centrifugal pumps, check the second video. Thank you.
Product of the flow rate and the pressure rise, right? So if the pressure rise is constant for all the flow rates, which is the case with radial vanes, okay, so then there is no contribution of the pressure rise in this term. So as Q increases, there is a linear. In the case of backward curved vanes, because there is a decrease of head with increase in flow rate, head into discharge product will go to a saturating trend, that is this. Okay. In the other case, where because as the flow rate increases, the pressure rise increases, the product will show an exponential increase. That's the point being made.
Out of motor. So backward curved blades, which has got self-stabilizing characteristics, in power.
Okay.
In radial blades, since pressure does not have any connection with flow rate, power consumption increases linearly. In forward curved blades, since pressure head increases with flow, power consumption increases exponentially, making the operation unstable. This will lead to burnout of motor. So backward curved blades, which has got self-stabilizing characteristics, in power consumption is the most preferred one in industry. To know more practical aspects of centrifugal pumps, check the second video. Thank you. In this lecture, we will learn design aspects of centrifugal pumps. More precisely, we will learn how to select a centrifugal pump and motor for pumping fluid at a specified rate for a given system. Before going to design part, we will extend the theoretical knowledge gained in first video to more practical sense. We have discussed that energy head developed by backward curve pump decreases linearly with flow. But this is theoretically maximum energy head possible, obtained assuming whole shaft power input got transformed to fluid energy. This is true only for ideal cases. In practice, there will be lots of energy losses associated with pump flow. One of the main energy loss is due to effect of friction in the flow. This loss increases quadratically with velocity. A similar loss occurs when there is sudden expansion or contraction. Magnitude of this is also proportional to velocity squared. So, head curve will come down like this. This is the reason why we always try to transform dynamic part of fluid energy to static part in a centrifugal pump. Next is due to recirculation effect in the flow. When flow is below the design flow rate, recirculation losses becomes predominant, as shown in figure. When pump operates at its design flow rate, recirculation loss is almost zero. If there is a difference in blade angle and flow angle, it will cause further loss. Here energy loss happens due to flow impingement and recirculation effect.
This is again prominent in off-design flow conditions. So, it tends to have higher losses as we move away from design flow rate point. Energy losses we have discussed so far, which reduce head of the flow, is known as hydraulic loss. So this will be the effective head versus flow rate curve. The shape could be anything like this, depending upon pump parameters. Such curves are known as pump performance curves. Please note that it is quite difficult to determine pump performance curve theoretically, rather they are determined experimentally. Using pump performance curve, one can easily predict what's the pressure rise across the pump by applying energy equation across it. Now, we will see how much power fluid is gaining from pump power input, or shaft power. Power gained by the fluid will be lower than the power supplied. One main factor is hydraulic loss, as we discussed. Other factors are volumetric loss and mechanical loss. So, efficiency of a pump can be defined as power gained by fluid by power supplied to the pump. For a typical centrifugal pump,
This volumetric loss is basically the leakage. So the fluid that is pushed by the impeller is not all going to the discharge side, but some of it can come back to the suction side either through the rear side of the impeller or through the gaps that are there in the casing and impeller. So because of that, you can lose some amount of the water that has got pumped to the high side by leakage. So that's the volumetric loss. Mechanical loss, of course, is because of the friction in the shaft and friction in the bearing and all those.
efficiency will vary like this. Corresponding shaft power variation is as follows. You can note that there is an operating point in pump where efficiency is maximum. It is known as best efficiency point. It is marked on head curve here. For a particular casing, we can fit different sized impellers in it. For a larger impeller, head curve will be like this, and this is the best efficiency point. For impellers of smaller size, head curve will vary like this. Best efficiency points are again marked. So back to the basic question, how to select a centrifugal pump for this application. Main condition is that fluid should be pumped at a particular flow rate to a specified height. Performance characteristics of the system is given in a system curve. It means how pressure drop varies in system with flow rate. Depending upon minor losses and major losses in network, it would vary like this. Please note that system curve will change drastically depending upon valve opening. Assume this is the system curve at a particular valve opening. Required flow rate is marked here. The operating point of pump will be intersection point of system curve and pump performance curve. So, depending upon selection of impeller, the pump could operate anywhere here. But we have a requirement of specified flow rate. Out of these operating points, this is the one which is most near to the required flow rate. So, we will select this impeller. In the same graph, we can represent ESO efficiency curves. So, efficiency at the operating condition also can be determined. The required shaft power can be calculated using this equation. This will lead to proper motor selection. This pump will operate well if it can overcome one more problem. A problem of cavitation. We will learn how to design against cavitation in a detailed, separate video.
Actually, what I figured out is that
If
this particular website is quite interesting. I would suggest that you people try it out because it has a lot of instructional videos on many mechanical engineering systems and components. It's also mechanical, electrical, civil, but mechanical engineering is what you people might want to. This has quite nice, interesting instructional videos. All the 3 videos that I showed now are from this website, and I recommend that you check out this website. It's quite a good learning tool. Say for example, I am looking for pumping water to the overhead tank on the top of the main building from the sump under the main building, right. So, you have, let us say I am trying to use a 6-inch pipe. Okay. So, I have a certain pipe with certain number of bends and certain height, certain length, certain diameter. So, through that, if I put different flow rates, the pressure drops will be different. So, the power requirement will be the pressure drop multiplied by the flow rate at each of those conditions. So, that is your system curve. The system curve is the pressure rise required at different flow rates for operating that particular system, right. So, this has got nothing to do with the pump, irrespective of what the pump is. If I have this kind of a pipe and this many number of bends and this much of length, then for different flow rates it will have different pressure drops. So, that is my system curve. Now, this I have to match with what the pump can deliver, and wherever these two curves actually intersect, where the pump has a slightly more capacity as compared to the system requirement, is what I will choose. Okay, so that is what we have done. We have a required flow rate. Let us say the overhead tank has to fill in about half an hour time. So, the flow rate that I require, I know the capacity of the overhead tank, so I know how much flow rate I would require, and I know the total pressure head that is there. So, I know the operating point on the pressure curve which I require. So, I see which one of the pumps. So, these curves that are there for the pump operation is what the manufacturer gives you. So, if you go to the market and ask for pump catalogs, the pump catalogs, they will basically give you the head discharge characteristics of different pumps. So, you will have to put the head discharge characteristic of the different pumps with your requirement curve and see which pump matches your requirement closely with a slight surplus of capacity. So, that is how you select, okay, this is the pump that I would require for my application. That is what the explanation is. And from that, then you also evaluate the efficiency and try to see what is the size of the motor that you would require to run that pump, and you select the motor accordingly. So, you will need to first characterize your application so that you get the QR versus head curve, that is your system curve. You match it with the pump curves that are available from the market and select the nearest pump that works best for you, and for that pump you then figure out what is the best motor that you should use, so that the motor has slight surplus capacity to be able to operate the pump, and that is how you select the motor, right. In each of these, if the slight surplus capacity is too much in excess, then you end up deviating substantially from the design point. Then your efficiency of the overall operation would come down, and that is what you find in most of the small sized pumps. You always over select pumps. So, in fact, you could well have done with a very small power input or a very small application as compared to what you are actually using, but that is what you are using. Okay, this is something which commonly happens. So, if you make an estimate across the country of all the pump sets that are running to pump water, the best efficiency point is taken care of only in pumps which are higher than 5 kilowatt size, 5 kilowatts, 7.5 kilowatts and higher. That is where the best efficiency point is taken care of. In most of the other applications, it is not even taken care of at the time of purchase. And in countries like India, it is even worse, because you have manufacturers who know nothing about pump characteristics, but they still manufacture, right. So, the tolerances are not taken care of, the motors are rewound by people who know how to rewind motors, but not skilled into tuning the best efficiency point to your requirement. So, for example, you are running a factory and you have a pump which is 7.5 kilowatts, it is running and suddenly there is a motor burnout. So, you call a local electrician and tell him to rewind the motor for you. The motor that he rewinds and gives you is a completely different motor as compared to what you had earlier. So, if you now measure the characteristics and the overall efficiency of your system, your power consumption has gone up substantially, your efficiency has gone down substantially, and you do not even notice, you just keep running it because you had a pump that was not working, you fixed it and it is working now. So, you are operating it. But if you do an energy audit, you figure out that it is substantially bad. So, unless all these procedures are properly standardized, the operation of pumps can lead to substantially increased power consumption. And if you do it, for example, just with agricultural pumps across the country, which would be millions in number, right, you will find that the amount of power consumption that is taken by those because of the lack of understanding of efficiency or correctness of operation is huge. I will give you a very simple example at your own doorstep. All of you use desert coolers, right? Right? Desert coolers have a pump which pumps the water from your sump to the felt pads that are around it. What is the flow rate and what is the pressure head that you would require? The pressure head is about 1 meter from the pump level to the top of the cooler. The cooler is hardly about a meter tall, and the flow rate is hardly of the order of a few liters per minute, right? You can measure that. You can take the pipe out and put it in a bucket of water, just run the pump and see how much time it takes to fill up a 10-liter bucket, right? It's hardly about 2, 3, 4 liters per minute. That's the kind of flow rate. So if you calculate the power that is required, rho into Q, delta P into Q, just calculate that, it will come to hardly a fraction of a few watts, right? You require something like 3 kg per second, or 3 kg per minute rather, 3 kg per minute multiplied by a delta H, which is rho g of water into 1 meter height or 1.5 meters height. So if you just calculate these, it works out to a few watts. Okay, it may not be even 5 watts. You can calculate that quickly. May not be even 5 watts. The cooler motor that you use, the pump motor that you use, these days you use submersible motors, and those motors are reasonably more efficient. Okay, so the power input to those motors is of the order of a few tens of watts, let's say 30, 40, 50 watts. Earlier you used to use those long pumps where the motor was outside rotating and the shaft was rotating inside the water. So that kind of a pump usually consumes something to the order of anywhere between 60 to 100 watts. Okay. So for electrical power requirement of typically of the order of 5 watts, you are using something like 60 to 80 or 100 watts motor, and this is in millions. So many people use it, every household. The power that we use is actually about almost 10 times at least, if not 20. Right. So this is commonly happening in practically all kinds of motor applications across the country now. Okay, so that's something which you need to know in context of centrifugal pumps. The concept of cavitation, lights off. The concept of cavitation, which was mentioned in the first video that we saw, is that at suction, at the suction point of the impeller, because of the centrifugal action, the water getting pushed away, at the suction the pressure goes down below atmospheric, or the below the surroundings, right? And you connect it to the sump so that this suction is utilized to pull the water up. Now you have a choice of where you would like to mount the motor from the surface of the liquid. Okay, so suppose the surface of the water is at the ground level here. I can put the pump here, 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 right? How do you choose that head, which is called a suction head, is governed by cavitation. Okay. Suppose you have a well which is, let's say, 30 meters deep, and you have to pull out water from that. The pump, if you keep it at the ground level, then you already have a 30 meters of negative head of water. The pump will just not be able to work. Calculate what is 30 meters of negative head. It is minus 3 atmospheres, right? So you cannot have negative pressure, so it cannot work. The pump will not be able to pick up water. So you will need to actually lower the pump closer to the level of water, because 1 atmosphere is approximately 10 meters of water column. Right. So you need to actually keep the pump as close as, and while doing that, if your static pressure at the impeller, at the inlet of the impeller, is anywhere close to the vapor pressure of water at that temperature. So you are pumping up water which is at 25 degrees, 30 degrees Celsius. At 25, 30 degrees Celsius, it has its own vapor pressure, right, which will be something like 0.1 atmospheres, 0.12 atmospheres, 0.15 atmospheres. So the static pressure locally near the impeller anywhere goes below the vapor pressure of water. Instantaneously the liquid water will become vapor. Okay. So you create vapor bubbles, but then because this is a pumping device and these vapor bubbles will be carried with the water that is flowing towards a higher pressure side, these vapor bubbles will then get compressed by pressures which are higher than the vapor pressure, and the vapor will condense and the bubbles will collapse. Bubbles will collapse and finally disappear. But this process of collapsing normally happens onto the surface of the solid because of the kind of flow it happens and because of the kind of pressure distribution that is there. So what ends up happening is each of these vapor bubbles go and collide on the solid like small particles of sand. Okay. And at each of those points, when the radius becomes extremely small, the pressure impulse that it creates at that point is sufficient to create erosion of the surface. Okay. So this is what we call as cavitation damage. So if there is a pump which is operating under conditions of cavitation where the suction head is low because of either mounting the pump too high or the static pressure in that area itself being low. For example, in the case of condensate extraction pump, in the case of a power plant, the condensate is available at saturation conditions, right. So the pressure is already equal to the saturation vapor pressure. So if you suck it, you are going to suck it to the pressure which is lower than that, so immediately it is going to cavitate. Okay. So in a condensate extraction pump, in the case of a power plant, cavitation is going to be a major issue with the condensate extraction pump because you need to suck the water which is already at its vapor pressure, right. In the case of other pumps, the suction head needs to be taken care of. So you define something called a net positive suction head. Suction head basically is the stagnation pressure at any cross section. Okay. So at the inlet or the suction point of the pump, if you calculate the stagnation pressure, which is P by rho g plus V squared by 2g, which is the stagnation head, this minus PV by rho g, which is vapor pressure by rho g, you convert it into the corresponding heads. Okay. So the stagnation pressure at the inlet minus the saturation vapor pressure divided by rho g is what you call the suction head, net positive suction head. Okay. The stagnation pressure minus the vapor pressure. This needs to be such that the static pressure never goes below PV. Okay. So which basically means that this NPSH should be V squared by 2 at least at any given point of location. If it goes below that, there will be cavitation. So you normally have these cavitation curves for each of these pumps, and your mounting location should be determined by ensuring that this cavitation pressure is not reached in the suction place. Okay. And because the impeller is rotating, as the velocity increases, there is a likelihood of decrease in pressure near the suction side of the impeller. The suction side of the impeller bears the most of the brunt of the cavitation damage. Okay. And that is something which you need to prevent. Otherwise, if you are having a pump which is operating continuously for, let us say, a period of 6 months to 1 year, half of the impeller will be gone. Okay. It will basically erode the impeller little by little. The metal will be taken away with the water that is flowing, and practically after some time the whole impeller would have been eaten up. There will be nothing left. Right. So that is typically what happens in a cavitation damage, and we need to prevent that. Okay. So that is about centrifugal pumps. Now coming back to power plants, let us look at what we saw. I hope you do not need the video of the power plant to recall what we saw in the power plant. Do you need that? Should I play that video again? How many say yes? Okay, so I will not play the video. What happened? Somebody says yes. You want the video on or not? No. Okay. All right. So let us try to recall. Let us look at the coal power plant that we visited first. Okay. So what are the major components that we saw in the coal power plant? Where did we enter the coal plant first? We first went to the control room. We first went to the control room. Okay. Fine. So from there, where did we go? we went to the turbine hall, right. So the major component that you saw is the turbine, okay. Then from the turbine hall we went up to the boiler, right. We climbed up the boiler, and then when we came down from the boiler, then we went to the lower floors, or first we went to the lower floors and then we climbed the boiler. Okay, first we went to the lower floors and then we climbed the boiler. The two groups might have gone in different orders, that's fine. So in the lower floors, what all did we see? The most significant components that we saw there. We saw feed water heaters. How many of you came for the power plant visit? Jago. Jago, Jago. Did you see something there? How many of you were blindfolded during the visit? कितने लोगों को आंख पट्टी बांधी हुई थी? So what all did you see? What are the components that you saw? Pulverizers, bunkers, cooling towers, huh? What is it? Ant? Sand? Fans, okay. The PA fan and the FD fan, okay. Then? Boiler, ESP, electrostatic precipitators, yes, yes. Then in the floor below the turbine, what all did you see? Okay, one group didn't go there, the other group went there. In the floor below the turbine, the largest component there is the condenser, which is right under the turbine. Then you had feed water heaters, LP heaters and HP heaters. So let's try to put them in perspective. Okay. Turbine, which is the main power producing unit, connected to the generator, right. Right under the turbine was the condenser. Okay. And from the turbine there were bleeds taken. Steam was taken out from different parts of the condenser, from the different parts of the turbine at different pressures. So there were some lines coming from the HP turbine, something coming from the IP turbine, something coming from the LP turbine. Okay. Each of them going through a feed water heater. Okay, so you had HP heaters, you had the LP heaters. So what did these do? What are these devices for? Not exhausted steam, but the bleed steam. So from the turbine you bring out some amount of steam, okay, and that goes in a coil like this, okay. Or okay, the steam comes in from here into this thing, the feed water goes in a coil like this, and on top of the coils the steam condenses, transferring heat to the feed water. So the feed water gets heated up. Okay. So what is the purpose of doing this? If I look at the boiler process is this, this and this. Okay. This part of the non-isothermal heating of the water is done by bleeding steam from the turbine and using that energy to heat this. Okay, so you bleed steam from the turbine at different locations and use a feed water heater at each of these locations to be able to heat it from one point to the other. So the entire liquid water heating, when this is still in liquid state, the water feed water is still in liquid state, much of the heating is done by using regeneration. Okay, so you have a regenerative cycle. So your turbine process is not an adiabatic process anymore. Okay, what we have normally studied in the basic thermodynamic cycle of a power plant is that the turbine process is adiabatic. Okay, there is no heat losses, nothing happening. The entire expansion takes place in the turbine, but that is not the way we normally operate it. We keep bleeding out the working fluid and using that working fluid for heating the water. Okay, so there is a heat connection between this line and this line, the two vertical sides. One is the expansion, the other is the compression and heating. There is a heat transfer from here to here, which is internal to the cycle. There is nothing externally supplied. Okay, so this is what we call the regeneration. Some amount of energy that's already available in the cycle is utilized to raise the temperature of something else. There are two implications of this. One is what I told you, that the turbine becomes non-isentropic. There is energy extracted from the turbine. Now the entire class has to sit up straight. Nobody is going to use the backrest of the class. I see 30% of the class sleeping now, shameless fellows. We are being recorded in this. Huh? Yeah. So the cycle is a regenerative cycle. You don't utilize, you don't let the turbine be adiabatic, but you extract energy from the turbine and heat the feed water. Okay. So the non-isothermal heat addition part, which actually brings the efficiency of the cycle down. Carnot cycle has the highest possible efficiency. Why does Carnot cycle have the highest possible efficiency? Because its heat addition happens at one constant temperature, which is the maximum in the cycle. Okay. So if I have to make this cycle efficiency equal to the Carnot cycle efficiency, then I should add all the heat in the boiler at the highest temperature of the cycle, which is not possible in this particular case because superheating has to happen with change of temperature. So this non-isothermal part, which is the superheating part, you cannot help. So you allow that to bring the efficiency down a little bit at the cost of, at the effect of increasing the power, right? But this non-isothermal part, which brings down the average temperature of heat addition in the boiler, that you do by regenerating, so that the overall cycle efficiency goes up. So this is the thermodynamic implication. The thermodynamic implication of the regeneration part is that you increase the average temperature at which energy is added in the boiler. Okay. So now if I start adding heat in the boiler here and up to here, the average temperature will be something here, higher than this. Okay. So the average temperature of heat addition will be somewhere here. But if I had this also in the boiler, then the average temperature of heat addition can come down, depending on the amount of heat added here, and heat added here. So the average temperature of heat addition has to be increased and kept up, and that is done by regeneration, and therefore the overall cycle efficiency goes up by regeneration. The other thing that happens because of this regeneration process is that because the boiler is with irreversibilities, there is an increase in entropy in the boiler, right? So by extracting heat from the steam that is flowing through the boiler, we bring that curve further towards closer to adiabatic or maybe subadiabatic. So if I draw the TS diagram, the turbine process, this is the isentropic turbine, this is the non-isentropic turbine, which is adiabatic. By extracting heat, I bring this line closer to the left. Okay, I would make it either isentropic, or I might end up bringing it to the left depending on the amount of heat that I extract. The amount of heat that I extract normally tries to bring it as close to the isentropic as you can by the process of extraction. So, you normally have a certain number of feed water heaters which you use depending on the maximum temperature of the cycle. Okay, depending on the temperature at which the steam enters the turbine, or depending on the pressure at which the steam enters the turbine, the number of feed water heaters vary. Okay. In most of the subcritical power plants of the kind that we saw there, the boiler that we saw was subcritical because the pressure of the boiler is less than the critical pressure of water. Critical pressure of water is about 220 atmospheres. The pressure of the boiler that we saw is something like 190 bar, right. So, in such subcritical boilers, the number of feed water heaters usually is 7, 6 closed feed water heaters and 1 deaerator. Okay. A deaerator is where the feed water and steam are not distinctly separated like this, but you have the feed water here and the steam is mixed with it. Okay. And the dissolved gases can escape and you have a vent. Okay. So, that is why it is called a deaerator. So, every time the steam goes through the deaerator, whatever dissolved gases in it are thrown out, and so that the water is not corrosive anymore. Okay. Otherwise, the water can become corrosive. So, to make the water non-corrosive, you need a deaerator in the cycle. So, that is one of the feed water heaters where the steam and water are mixed, and the other feed water heaters are of this kind where the feed water flows inside the pipes and steam condenses outside the pipes. सीधे बैठो और दोबारा सोते हुए देखूंगा तो यहाँ तक कुछ फेंकूंगा तुम्हारे ऊपर. And that's a warning not to him, to all of those fellows who are feeling sleepy. Okay. That's the feed water heater. What are the other components that you saw? Condenser is something that you understand. It again has the steam coming from the turbine like this, and the cooling water that comes from the cooling towers and recirculates back to the cooling towers in pipes like this. The steam condenses and you get what is called a hot well, which is the condensate, which will be at the saturation temperature, and from there you have the condensate extraction pump, which by design should cavitate because the water that is being taken is already at its vapor pressure. Okay. So, if you use a suction, then the suction has to be at a lower pressure than vapor pressure. So, it is by design supposed to cavitate. Right. So, that is the condensate extraction pump. Okay. So, from the condenser you have the CEP, the condensate extraction pump. Okay. So, the water comes to the condensate extraction pump, goes through the LP heaters, okay, and then goes to the boiler feed pump. Okay. And from the boiler feed pump it goes through the HP heaters and then to the economizer. So, this is the water path. The water from the turbine goes to the condenser. From the condenser it goes to the condensate extraction pump, goes as feed water to the low LP heaters where the LP turbine steam is condensed. Okay. Then it goes to the boiler feed pump. So, the water becomes a high pressure water now, and then it goes to the HP heaters because HP heater also has water, the steam at a higher temperature. Okay. So, from the HP heater the water goes very close to the saturation point, and then it goes to the economizer. Economizer is the tail end of the flue gases. Okay. From the boiler the steam, the flue gases, just before they go out, they go through the economizer. Okay. So, then after the economizer the water goes to the steam drum. Which is what you saw at the top floor of the boiler. Those of you who climbed the boiler, at the top floor of the boiler you saw the steam drum. Okay. So, the economizer water is taken to the drum, and from there it goes to the evaporator in a cycle. Okay. So, the pipes taking the water downwards are outside the boiler, and then the entire wall of the boiler is lined with pipes that take the water back up to the boiler drum. So, you have loops that come from the boiler drum down to the header at the bottom and then climb through the boiler, get evaporated and go up back to the steam drum. Here I told you there are two kinds of possibilities. In all the 210 megawatt boilers which we did not see in the Dadri power plant, there are 4 210 megawatt units. There the circulation is entirely natural circulation. Okay, so you do not need any motors or pumps there. The entire circulation happens because of the density difference between these two lines. Okay, this line is water which is denser, this line is water plus steam which is heated up, so which is lighter. So, this rises up and this comes down and the flow is established. So, the total flow rate of water steam in that loop is about 6 to 7 times the rate of generation of steam. Okay, so 1/7 of the water or 1/6 of the water evaporates in the boiler and the remaining remains as liquid water and keeps circulating between the drum and the header. Okay, so that is your circulation ratio that you maintain. Usually you maintain a circulation ratio between 6 and 7, right. After that the steam comes back to the boiler, so partly water and partly steam. The steam drum separates them out by using various processes. The process could be gravity, or the process could be using cyclones or various such acceleration measures which will increase the acceleration between the liquid and vapor. You can just use G, or you can use G plus some other accelerating factor which is like a cyclone or any such mechanism, which will separate out the liquid from the vapor, because at that high pressure, if you look at the PV diagram, at that high pressure Vf and Vg start getting closer to each other. Okay, so the density of the liquid and the density of vapor are not substantially different. So, if you just use gravity, separating them out is going to be increasingly difficult as you get closer to the critical point. Okay, so you use gravity and other additional measures in the steam drum to separate the liquid and vapor. Then the vapor from there goes back to the boiler superheater. Okay, and from the superheater the steam goes to the HP turbine. Then from the HP turbine the steam comes back to reheaters and goes to the LP turbine. These are reheaters and goes to the LP turbine. Okay. So, where are these positioned in the boiler? If I look at the boiler that we saw, this is typically the shape of the boiler. The boiler drum is positioned somewhere here, the top, right. So, now the low temperature superheaters and low temperature reheaters are here, the intermediate temperature superheaters and reheaters are here, the high temperature superheaters and reheaters are here. They are all pipes that are suspended from the roof of the boiler all over the place, and economizer is here, okay, and the gases that come out from the economizer run what is called an air preheater. Okay. So, this is a rotating wheel of a very large size. This rotates about its axis, and in rotating it goes through the hot gases and takes energy from it, and this basically rotating wheel is actually filled with scrap metal. Okay, it is a porous wheel which has scrap metal filled in it. So, the gases can flow through it and heat up these scrap metal, and when it comes to the other sector where air is flowing through it, the air will absorb this energy from the scrap metal and get heated up. So, the scrap metal will get cooled down. So, this cycle continues. This whole air preheater keeps rotating at a low speed, something of the order of 2 revolutions or 3 revolutions per minute in a continuous cycle. Okay. So, the hot gases flow through it and heat it up and go away, and the cold air flows through it, gets heated and goes in. Okay. So, this is basically the air preheater mechanism. The cold air for the air preheater, there are two sectors. One sector gets the cold air from the primary air fan that we saw, and the other gets it from the forced draft fan that we saw, or the secondary air fan. Okay. So, these two supply the air to the air preheater. Through the air preheater, these two air streams get heated to temperatures at which they are designed to be heated, in the process cooling down the exhaust gases even further. Okay. After this, the exhaust gases go to the electrostatic precipitator. Okay, where using a high DC voltage, you are going to remove the ash from the air stream, because you have parallel plates which are grounded, and there are wires in between which give high voltage DC. Okay, the corona discharge from these wires charges the particles around, and the charged particles migrate towards the ground. Okay. So, from time to time you have hammers that wrap the plates, the electrodes. So, or whatever ash that is stuck to it falls down by gravity, and you collect it in the hopper at the bottom. Okay. So, that is your operation of electrostatic precipitator, and after that the gases go out to the stack. Okay. So, after the ESP you have the ID fan or the induced draft fan, and this goes to the chimney. Okay. So, that is the path of the flue gas, and the water path is clear. We have shown all the way the water that goes through all of these feed water heaters, economizer, steam drum evaporator, then superheaters, HP turbine, then back to reheaters, IP and LP turbine, and back to condenser and back to the same circuit, right. And the cooling water that is used in the condenser has a separate cycle, cooling towers, cooling water for condenser and back to the cooling tower. Okay. So, that is the third cycle that we had. Now, in all these places, what are the machines that we are seeing? First, let us look at the steam cycle. You have the condensate extraction pumps, which are again multi-stage centrifugal or axial flow pumps, and boiler feed pumps, which are multi-stage centrifugal pumps. Okay. So, you use condensate extraction pump, takes the water from its saturation pressure to around atmospheric pressure, and the boiler feed pump takes the water from atmospheric pressure to 200 atmospheres or 190 atmospheres, the boiler pressure. Okay. So, that is the two pumps that are there. The plant that we saw, these pumps are driven by a dedicated turbine. There is no electric motor in the main pump, but there is electric motor in the standby pump. In case the turbine driven boiler feed pump, the turbine fails or there is some problem with the turbine, you can switch over to the motor driven system, and in the meantime service the turbine. So, that turbine again takes steam from the main steam line. It operates the turbine, which generates something like 7 megawatts, and that is the 7 megawatt input that you require for running the boiler feed pump. Okay. So, you have what is called the turbine driven boiler feed pump there. So, the prime mover for the boiler feed pump, which is a centrifugal pump, is the turbine. Okay. So, this is one kind, and in the lower floor we also had the spare boiler feed pump, which had a 5 megawatt or 6 megawatt motor that is attached to it, which runs there. Okay. So, that is thing that we saw. Then in the 500 megawatt unit of power plant that we saw, we also have circulating pumps. For this circulation, it is not just sufficient to leave it to natural draft, because number one, the height of the boiler is also now more, and number two, the pressure of operation of the boiler is higher than the 210 megawatts by about 8 or 10 megawatts higher, 8 or 10 kilopascals, 8 or 10 bar. The pressure is closer to the what do you call the critical pressure. So, you need additional driving force. So, you have circulating pumps also installed here. Okay. So, again pumps, right. The condenser gets a huge quantity of water. The flow rate of water in the main circuit is usually about 1/500th of the flow rate or 1/200th of the flow rate of water that you require from the cooling tower to the condenser. Okay, the water that is in the main cycle is much smaller, but the quantity of water that flows in the condenser is huge. Okay, you can understand that because you are saying it's a 500 megawatt power plant, you are actually rejecting 750 megawatts in the condenser. Okay, 1.5 times of the power that you produce in the generator, you are rejecting in the condenser. So the quantity of water required for that is so large that the pipes that carry water to the condenser, if you saw, they would have been this big, whereas the main steam, even when it is in the vapor state, the main steam line is this big. Okay, so this is carrying steam at a specific volume which is 1000 times more than the water, or 10,000 times more than the water. That's only this big, but the liquid water pipes for the condenser are this big. So that's the magnitude of water flow that you have in comparison to this. So it's a much larger flow rate in condenser, and that also has a pump that circulates it. So this circulating pump for condenser cooling water is a pump that needs to handle a huge flow rate but a small head, because the pressure head is only given by the pressure drop in the length of the pipe, which is a couple of kilometers, of course, from the cooling tower to the power plant, but that's not going to be very large. It's not going to be 200 bar. It's going to be at best close to an atmosphere pressure, but not more than that. It may be even less than that. And the height to which the water has to go before it sprays in the cooling tower, which may be a few meters up to the order of about 10 meters. Okay, so the amount of pressure rise that is required in these pumps is very small, but the quantity of flow rate that they need to handle are huge. So naturally what you will use is what kind of pumps? High specific speed pumps. We'll be using pumps which handle a much larger mass flow rate with a smaller pressure rise. So axial flow pumps are usually used there, or mixed flow pumps. Okay, so these are the pumps, not centrifugal pumps, because centrifugal pumps are required for higher pressure rise, and in the boiler feed pump you have multi-stage centrifugal pumps, which basically means that you will have about 20 impellers in series, one after the other. Okay, because you have to raise the pressure to almost 200 bar, whereas in the case of the condensate circulation pump, the cooling water circulating pump in the condenser, you will use a pump which can handle much higher flow rates but with a moderate thing. So that's another device that we saw in the condenser. And when you came to the air side, you saw the primary air fan and the secondary air fan. Okay, the primary air fan requires to handle much higher pressure drops, because the primary air fan is the one, the primary air is the one that goes through the pulverizer, carries the coal and takes it to the burner, whereas the secondary air directly goes to the burner through much larger ducts. Okay, so again the kind of fan that is used is different. You use a centrifugal fan for primary air, and the forced draft fans are usually either axial flow fans or mixed flow fans. Okay, and the induced draft fan, the ID fan that you have and the FD fan or the PA fan that you have different characteristics. Just now I showed you a video which talked about forward curved radial and backward curved vanes, and what was told to you is backward curved vanes are industrially preferred, right? That was talked about in the context of centrifugal pumps, but it's also valid for centrifugal fans and blowers. So the PA fan, the primary air fan, uses a backward curved vane in the centrifugal blower that it uses, whereas the induced draft fan, because we need a design that operates at a much lower speed and still produces a large suction, you normally use a forward curved vane, because the induced draft fan works in a dusty environment. The exhaust gases carry ash with them, and the ash can deposit itself or corrode the surface. So you operate the RPM, the RPM of the induced draft fan is much lower than the FD fan. The FD fan operates in pure clean air, so there is no issue. So the ID fan uses forward curved vanes with a highly overrated motor, because otherwise, because of the characteristics, since the exponential increase in power input required is there, the motor can get burned out. So you normally use an overrated motor for the ID fans with much lower RPM. so that the ID fan doesn't get corroded that easily. Otherwise, if you operate the ID fan also at the same RPM as the FD fan, because of the ash particles present in the exhaust gases, the ID fan gets damaged much faster. So you normally use it at a lower speed with forward curved vanes. Okay. So this is one of the rare applications where a forward curved vane is preferred, right. So that's a typical thing. So that's about the air line. What other machines are there? Various other machines are basically, number one, for generator cooling, the stator and rotor cooling, you have hydrogen circulation there. So you have a compressor that has compressed hydrogen tank, and it flows through all of the small passages, because hydrogen has a much higher heat capacity and thermal conductivity as compared to any other gas. Although it is not inert, because of this property you use hydrogen, and you have to make sure that there is no leakage of oxygen to that area, so that the hydrogen has oxygen available to burn. Otherwise, it can create an explosion in the generator. Okay. So most modern generators are hydrogen cooled. Okay. They cool the rotor with hydrogen. It's a easy way of doing it because the inertia of hydrogen is low. The stators can be liquid cooled. The stator, the stationary part of the coil, can be cooled with water or cooled with any other liquid. But the rotor, because it is also rotating, you need to cool it using a gas, and the gas which has a very high thermal conductivity and very high heat capacity, so that it can remove the effective heat removal can be done with much lower mass flow rates of the gas. So you use hydrogen for cooling the thing. So there you have compressors or compressed tanks of hydrogen and circulation through that, which is another fluid moving system that is commonly used there. Besides that will be the lubrication system, because the amount of power generated is so much that even if the entire turbine rotor and the generator rotor is 99.5% efficient, 0.5% of 500 megawatts is a huge amount of heat to dissipate, right. 500 megawatts, 0.5% of it is something like 25 megawatts, no, 2.5 megawatts, right. So you have to actually remove 2.5 megawatts of frictional heat in all of these bearings, even if it is 99.5% efficient shaft, right. If the efficiency comes down to 99% for any reason, the amount of heat removed doubles, right. So that's a thing that you need to keep into, that's the thing that you need to keep into take into account while designing the lubrication system and the oil cooling system, because in the worst case the dissipations can go up by a factor of 3 or 4, and your oil cooler should be able to take care of that before you can actually bring the machine down for maintenance. So normally you do oil analysis and various other things, condition monitoring, so that you foresee any damage that is going to happen and take a preventive maintenance method rather than wait for it to fail. So again that is another process. Okay, so we will stop the lecture here. In the next lecture we will talk about the combined cycle and gas turbine power plants, basically wanting to relate whatever we did in the course with the components that are there, because each individual thing is a lot of detail to study, but we are now just trying to say, okay, this we studied, this is here, this is here, this is here, that is all we are trying to do.